This time, Grande Torino. The tragedy behind Italy's first greatest generation.
No, never, no more. 'Cause I'll stay a wild rover forever and more.
Hello and welcome to By Far the Greatest Team, a podcast in which football fans attempt the impossible to rank once and for all which team is the greatest team of all time. My name's Graham Dunn, as ever stating the case for Oxford United, and in our data sector, our data house, our data warehouse, it's Jamie Rooney.
Yeah, and I had a project. Hi, Graham. I gave myself a project. So I don't know if you remember last week when we did Millwall with the brilliant Stu. We stumbled down a rabbit hole, fell down a rabbit hole actually, towards the end where we started talking about celebrity football fans and Oscar winners. And Daniel Day-Lewis, 3 Oscars as a Millwall fan. We thought, coupled with Gary Oldman, as also a Millwall fan who won a single Oscar, 4 Oscars, that makes Millwall probably, cream of the crop in terms of football fans or football clubs with notoriety of winning Oscars. Turns out, and I should have known this, Gary Oldman is actually not a Millwall fan. He's actually a Manchester United fan, influenced in the 1960s by George Best. So Millwall have lost an Oscar and Manchester United have gained one. And then, Graham, I couldn't help myself but try to compile what I saw as a top 5 of football teams that can claim to have the most Oscars won. And
Okay,
I'm quite happy to share that with you if you're interested.
Well, I'm definitely interested. I mean, I'm surprised that I'm still reeling from the fact that a Southern-based person might choose to support Man United. That seems very, very odd to me. I can't quite get my head around how that could possibly happen.
Yeah, in my defence, I had no idea where Manchester was when I started supporting them as a 4 or 5-year-old, heavily influenced by my dad. But yeah, so a few honourable mentions before we get into what I've got as a top 5. Dame Judi Dench, 8 nominations. 8 nominations
that's
for an
good.
Oscar. Only won in Shakespeare in Love. Ironically, the one where she appears in the film for about 4 minutes. She got a supporting actor Oscar for that. Glenda Jackson, who kind of doesn't claim to be a Tranmere Rovers fan, but kind of is, has 2. And then, of course, Elton John has 2 Oscars, and he's a very, very famous Watford fan. But they're not even the top 5.
Yeah.
So at number 5, joining Gary Oldman, we've got Manchester United with 3. Danny Boyle and the wonderful, beautiful Julia Roberts, who we all know is a very, very big red.
Very good, very good. No, keep it coming. I mean, Julia Roberts, I'm not quite sure.
I'm kind of pausing thinking I've lost my audience, but, maybe I haven't. And again, with 3, we've already mentioned it, Daniel Day-Lewis at Millwall. And then there are 3 clubs that can claim to have 4 Oscars. We mentioned one last week, that's Chelsea. Michael Caine has 2 Oscars, and Sir Richard Attenborough, Dickie, the wonderful Dickie Attenborough, also has 2. That's 4. Nick Park, he of Wallace and Gromit fame, is a Preston North End fan. He has 4 Oscars.
Preston.
4 Oscars.
Oh, that is fantastic.
If we're counting short film.
That is fantastic. Yeah.
But before I give you the what I put as the top one, but it's also with 4 Oscars. I did do some research for Oxford United, hoping that there would be at least one. The closest I came was Woody Harrelson was spotted at the Kazam in 2017. So, to go along with Timmy Mallet and Michaela Strachan and Jim Rosenthal, you've got Woody Harrelson.
How many Wimbledon finals did you get to? Tim Henman. Come on, Tim.
I don't think Tim Henman made Wimbledon final. Yeah, he famously never made the final, did he? He fell at the final hurdle every time.
Well, I'm not sure he made any Oxford games. I think the link was very, very tenuous.
So my number 1, and they're equal with 4, but I feel it's only appropriate this week to say the number 1 team with the most Oscars that I could find in my very, very limited analysis is Sunderland. David Parfit, who's a producer, has an Oscar, and Tim Rice, born in Amersham, Buckinghamshire, is a Sunderland fan, and he has 3 Oscars. Sunderland. They're at the top.
Sunderland. If only we had someone from Sunderland who could comment on this. So joining us this week for this episode, it is our Sunderland correspondent, a man who occasionally we let talk about other things. It's Phil Craig. Hi, Phil.
Hi, Graham. Hi, Jamie. Nice to see you again. Tim Rice is one of the most well-known of Sunderland supporters that's out there. Kate Adie being another one. She must have won something like a BAFTA, I guess, at some point.
Oh, yeah.
James Herriot as well. I don't know what he maybe won some kind of book prize as well. He of All Creatures Greatness, but it's a cultural hub, really.
Very
Peter
much so.
O'Toole
I
as well.
would have thought.
Peter O'Toole is a Sunderland fan
Yes.
who famously,
Yes.
in David Lean's Lawrence of Arabia film, was the only one, I think, nominated not to win in that particular edition of the Oscars. Peter O'Toole's a Sunderland fan.
I wonder if Aston Villa can, because you've got Tom Hanks claims Aston Villa.
He does.
So I wonder if you could find another Villa fan across that. Tom Hanks and David Cameron, of course.
Oh, I thought it was West Ham.
So,
Claret
for
and
some
blue.
reason,
Claret and blue.
Yeah, Claret and blue. They're all the same. Excellent. We do have a couple of other bits to pick up on, actually, based on the Millwall pod, which is a very entertaining one. We were talking about the brilliant Cascarino Sheringham combination there, and we were arguing, were they the last great striker combination? Now, before we went on to the pod, I already had a counter-argument to this, but for reasons that completely escaped me, I failed to mention it on the pod itself. And Phil, I guess you might claim that there was a better, more recent striker combo from Sunderland.
Are we thinking about the great Super Kevin Phillips and Sir Niall Quinn? It's your kind of classic combo of the time. You don't see it anymore, do you? But the big, tall man and the smaller kind of striker feeding off him. Although I sometimes think that the idea that all that Quinn could do was just win balls in the air was perhaps a little bit unfair. He had some fantastic touches as well. But yeah, that was probably the last great pairing at Sunderland. Although, could I give an honourable mention just to kind of show my age to a previous kind of pair at Sunderland, which is Gabbiadini and Gates.
Gabbiadini and Gates.
Yeah, Marco Gabbiadini and Eric Gates. Yeah, not his brother Ricardo. He didn't have the same success. But yeah, Marco Gabbiadini, who's been unwell recently, actually. He's had a heart problem, so hopefully he's well. But Marco Gabbiadini and Gates were just absolutely fantastic. And it was less the tall, short man. They were all both particularly small, particularly kind of Eric Gates, of course. A lot of that was just down to the guile of Eric Gates and the pace of Gabbiadini.
There's some good shoulder-length blonde hair action going on in that partnership as well.
Oh yeah. Eric Gates in particular. There was a thought that maybe he was used by parents to scare their children into going to sleep at night. You know, say we'll send Eric Gates around. He was perhaps not the most handsome, but wow, what a streak! He came to Sunderland. He was one of the few bright spots of Laurie McMenemy's time at Sunderland. He brought in Eric Gates, and then later, of course, Gabbiadini joined him when Dennis Smith bought him from York City.
Of course, if you were looking to send a Sunderland striker around to scare your children, your first choice would probably be another man we mentioned on the pod last week, Sir Billy Whitehurst.
Yeah, Billy Whitehurst he wasn't at Sunderland for very long, and it was after Eric Gates, I think it was kind of coming to an end, or towards the end, if not the end of his career. And the basic tactical genius of Billy Whitehurst, who was a substantial individual, wasn't he? Was basically just to protect Marco Gabbiadini and injure and damage the centre-backs, therefore giving him space to run into. And I think he would have admitted that across all of the many and various clubs he worked at, really.
When he was at Oxford, he scored four goals across his 40 games, which is probably 4 more than I remember. But I do remember him just contributing. I mean, he's absolute mayhem there. Hull was the one where he really kind of made his name, but he did go on and have a period of enforcing spells at a number of clubs.
And it's worth just taking a little look at his kind of Wikipedia entry, just because if you've got enough time just to scroll through the many and various clubs that he played with between 1977 and 1994, He was, I suppose, a journeyman, really, wasn't he? He was only 17 games at Sunderland, for example. Scored 3 goals, which is not too bad a return, while he wasn't damaging centre-backs. But yeah, he's still remembered, I would say. He's still well thought of for his time.
So we should get on to tonight's team, which I'm not sure Billy Whitehurst would have made his way into, to be fair. We're looking back at an absolute classic story. And I think it's a story, actually, which certainly in Italy is as famous there as the Man United Busby Babes story would be for us, I guess, because there is a sort of a really tragic side to this story. But this Torino side are something special. Jamie, you're sort of pretty familiar with this team, and they do go on to achieve quite something special, don't they?
A lot of things that are special, yeah, including some championships in an incredibly great style and dominating style. And it all really begins with the idea of a single man, Ferruccio Novo, who was a former Torino player. Torino as a football team go back to formation in 1906. A Swiss financier called Alfred Dick, who was on the board of directors at Juve, got kicked out and disillusioned, went away and set up his own Turin club. So the rivalry was born directly from Juventus in terms of the Turin derby. And Torino won the odd championship when it was before the actual Serie A began in 1929. They won a Scudetto in the mid-1920s. But by and large, before the 1940s, football had been dominated by Juventus. They'd won 5 championships. Bologna had won 4. Bologna, a massive team going back into the 1930s. And then Ferruccio Novo became president in 1939, and he had a vision. He wanted to create he's kind of a modern thinker, really, in terms of where he was. He kind of looked at football not as a method, but more of a system. And we talk about systems quite often now in football, formations and shapes. But before then, the method was 2-3-5. But I think Novo had an idea that you could tinker with some of the playing staff and potentially get more out of the team. But he also, being a player, he understood the game. So he could relate to the game. But what he did at the early days, he surrounded himself by like-minded people. So a bit of a thinker in terms of not just the president who wants to be an owner of a team. He wants to have a very heavy footprint on the team, and brought in some very key individuals in the beginning, in 1939, that would shape the future of this incredible team that we're just about to go on and talk about.
So you mentioned that this Turin side, Torino, had won a Scudetto previously. They'd won in 1928. They also won one in 1927, but in something which seems extremely unusual for Italian football. Wasn't that one slightly marred by some a rarity in Italian football, a bit of bribery?
I can't believe we're not even 5 minutes in and you've already started to slander the brilliant game of Serie A football. Bribery has been around for a long time. It's been around in every country, but it does seem to perpetuate itself more in the Italian game. And I commend you highly on pointing that out at the very beginning.
So, you're right. This Torino side does have a pedigree, but not an extraordinary one. And heading into this period, I don't think it's obvious that this is going to come, other than the as we've seen with a few of these great teams in those more historical eras, that it is quite often one man's leadership, one or two people's leadership that comes in there. Prior to that, Torino it doesn't look as though they're going to become a dominating force of Italian football, does it?
No, they've been in the top division since its formation, but they kind of been finishing in top half positions and not really threatening to win a championship until Novo comes around. But ironically for Ferruccio Novo, when he's just about to embark on this journey in 1939, there's something a bit bigger going on in the world that may just cause a bit of a spanner in the works for him.
I mean, this is one of the really interesting things when you look back at this. So though Torino get the vast majority of their wins towards the end of the 1940s, this era begins during the Second World War. And it's quite obvious that football is continuing in Italy during this period. Now, that seems quite strange to me.
Well, yes and no. I mean, it continued right through to 1944 in Germany. And, one could argue that they were probably more of a centerpiece to the Second World War than Italy, who were definitely one of the big players. But yeah, Mussolini had decided in his infinite wisdom that the war would be over pretty quickly. So there was no point sending the top-class sportsmen, the footballers, to go to battle. We keep them at home so they can entertain the people. So yeah, football continued on in Italy right through the Second World War, with just a very small pause in around about 1944. But even then, they created what was called the War Championship, which we can talk about in a bit as well.
Slightly strangely, I mean, it sort of seems that Mussolini didn't, for all the bad press I think you could attach to Mussolini. His approach to the war seems to be very much, I'll join it late. It's only going to last for a small bit. I'll just come in and pick up some spoils because it's kind of 1940 by the time he gets here. I think, it's all over. I'll just cash in on this carving the lands up. Only to find it pretty disastrously. Managed to have called that pretty disastrously, I think.
Yeah, and I think he probably picked the wrong side when he decided to join as well. I mean, with all this going on, it hasn't really stopped Nove from wanting to create a fantastic football team, and he's already thinking about how he's going to shape that. And one of the key things that he does is he brings in what we probably call today a technical football director, a director of football, Ernest Einstein, and that really, it's kind of like the yin to the yang. They really do develop an incredibly strong friendship, relationship, and they share the same vision for what they want Torino to become.
So Ernstein is an interesting character, and Phil, it'd be fair to say you've allowed yourself to become quite distracted by his quite fascinating life. And again, this is one of the things with stories around here, around this period, when they're sort of set against the backdrop of the war. You do have some quite extraordinary backstories, which sort of make, on the one hand, make the football kind of seem like a total distraction. But he's a very interesting character, isn't he?
He is. He's absolutely fascinating, and his life, although cut short, was utterly fascinating. So he was born in 1898 to a Jewish family, which becomes quite important. His parents moved to Budapest early in his life, along with his parents and his two brothers. He's a good student and also a good footballer as well. He joins the youth ranks at the Budapest Athletic Club. Not the best team in Budapest, but a good one, good middle of the table team, and he plays as a central midfielder in that team. World War I intervenes when he's 18 in 1916, and he volunteers to join the Habsburg army. Early signs of his leadership skills at this point. He's only 18 years old, but he's a sergeant, and he leads a squad of soldiers into action, probably around northeast Italy. So his first introduction to Italy, if not Italian football. And on his return back from war, at the end of the war, he leads his troops into a kind of insurrectionist social democratic movement called the Asta Revolution, which ultimately kind of contributed to Hungarian independence. So he's only 18, 19, and he's already had a pretty interesting life, and he's starting to show some signs that he's got some very special kind of qualities. He ends up kind of going back and playing for Budapest Athletic Club, BAK. He does have some signs of a certain Billy Whitehurst tendency to him, to be honest. He's known as a particularly physical footballer. There's one game in particular in 1922 against the Budapest University team in which he committed a foul that was considered so brutal at the police officer on duty was asked to intervene and investigate his two-footed tackle. And unfortunately for Erbstein, the officer on duty just happened to be the victim's brother, who recommended that the police file charges not just against Erbstein, but also against the referee, because he didn't actually send off Erbstein. I'm not quite sure what happens. There's no record of what happens next, so I presume that that nothing really kind of came of that. But he did kind of develop kind of quite a reputation. He wasn't the greatest footballer. He moved around a little bit. Ended his career, actually, interestingly, playing for a Jewish sporting club in a tour of America, where I think he became quite influenced in some of the new tactics that were influencing the American football that was developing at the time, which was heavily influenced by what was kind of coming over from England as well. He hung up his boots, possibly partly because of the pressure, because of the way he played, but there was increasing kind of anti-Jewish sentiment building up at the time, and he got his first opportunity at Barry. He wasn't particularly successful there. He didn't really have the players to mould and develop, or the time to kind of do it. Ended up at two other clubs, Nosarina, Calgary, and Barry again before his first great success, which was in 1933 to 1938, where he went to Lucchese. And this was again a kind of quite a fascinating time. Lucchese were partly successful because he was a good talent spotter, and he was prepared to take players who were getting pushed out of other clubs because they wouldn't toe the line, and particularly they wouldn't toe the line by doing what the fascists were expecting them to do, including the fascist salute as well. So he picked up some players who were of very high standard, wouldn't have normally have found their time in Lucchese, but were being pushed out, and he kind of gave them a home. Unfortunately, again for him, Lucca, the marvelous city in Tuscany, walled city, was also a center of the growth of fascism in northern Italy as well. So he became under increasing pressure to leave the club. He became sick in the end and had to take some kind of extended sickness absence. And the suggestion was that, well, it was said that he was leaving the club because of ill health, when in reality he was probably under a fair amount of pressure because he wouldn't toe the line as well. And in May 1938, he joined Torino as coach as well. Turin at that time was probably slightly less towing the line with Mussolini, was probably a little bit more anti-fascist than other cities in Italy. But just a few months later, in July 1938, there was the Manifesto of Race. So this was an anti-Semitic law which stripped the Italian Jews of their citizenship and also their professional positions. So by December of that year, December of 1938, his embryonic career at Torino, which was going to become such great success, was at least at the moment, and at least on paper, coming to an end as well. Although we'll probably find out that he kept in contact with Novo and was actively involved in the development of the team during the Second World War.
The war presumably intervenes at this stage.
Yeah, he's offered a kind of a swap. The coach, there's a club in Rotterdam. Their coach becomes a coach at Torino, and he's offered the position at Rotterdam. And he's on his way with his family from Italy through Germany into the Netherlands, when he's stopped on the train by the SS. And he spent a number of weeks with his family in a so-called Jew house in Cleve. And it's suggested actually it's the Torino chairman, Novo, who, there's a few factors to this. The Torino chairman arranged with the Hungarian embassy for his passage back to Hungary. But again, Erbstein, he is a remarkable individual that fought ahead and was able to bribe one of the SS guards in the house where his family was staying with some diamonds. He decided, with great foresight, to basically kind of cash in the cash he had and get diamonds, and he sewed them into his clothes and was able to give one of those diamonds to a guard to help his passage into back up to his original home in Hungary and to Budapest.
So he ends up in Budapest. How does he end up back when does he end up back in Torino?
Well, he's in Budapest, and Hungary didn't enter the war until 1940. There was still rising anti-Semitic tension, particularly in Budapest, but across Hungary. But at least at the beginning, he was able to, although he couldn't get an official position, certainly not in football, he was able to kind of form what became quite a successful textile business with his brother. So for a number of years, he and his family were doing relatively well, but over time, there was an increasing amount of tension, anti-Semitic violence in the country. And by 1943, 1944, an increasing number of Jewish people, particularly in Budapest, but around the country, were being forcibly removed to Germany and into concentration camps, and particularly in terms of Auschwitz. Ernstein's wife and two daughters found sanctuary in a convent on the outskirts of Budapest. And there's a touch of Schindler's List to this. The factory was a convent, but was transformed into a factory producing uniforms for the war ministry, but was actually being used to protect Jewish families at the same time. Ernstein couldn't find any sanctuary in the convent, so he was forced to report to a forced labor camp. Although on his first day, he actually kind of met one of his ex-sergeants for his time in the Habsburg army in the First World War, who was now an orderly, actually kind of helped him to keep in contact with his family. So he, for a good number of, a fair amount of time, he was able to he was under a lot of pressure, a lot of tension. There's a remarkable story of the convent being raided by fascists. There was a grave danger at one point that actually Erbstein's family could have been kind of killed in there. As the pressure increased, and with the help potentially of the camp guard, he was able to kind of move further out of Budapest and join his sister-in-law's house, where his wife and family joined him there. His wife and family found some work in the Swedish diplomatic mission in Budapest. Ernő Erbstein couldn't do that, so he had to live in secret in the attic of his sister-in-law's house until December 1944, when the Swedes at least gave him some kind of temporary papers. It's not quite sure from the kind of the official history. His wife and two daughters had basically kind of forged papers, so they could live in the house with some degree of freedom of movement, but not Erbstein. He had to live in the attic. He couldn't get out, and kind of food had to be kind of taken to him until basically the Soviet occupation of Budapest, which happened in 1945.
So it's absolutely extraordinary kind of existence. What's quite surreal, whilst all this is going on, the story of Torino as a football club is developing, Jamie, isn't it? Because that actually is the period in which the investment in the club is starting to take shape.
So whilst Ernstein is corresponding with Novo via letter and distance and time, Novo's getting on to build the club that he wants, and he's working out that he has a system, and now he's doing the very sensible thing. He's identifying players that will fit that system that he wants to play on the football pitch. And the very first signing he gets is in the 1940-41 season is a Franco Orzola, a winger, a very fast winger. And this is in the days where it was the WM formations, so 3 at the back, 2 holding midfielders, 2 kind of deep line attackers, and then 3 forwards, of which 2 would be wingers and 1 will be a number 9, but in some systems a number 10 as well, and there would be that level of rotation. So the signing of Orsola comes in, but doesn't really change the fortunes of Torino at that particular moment. In the 41-42 season, Novo really goes to town. He makes 5 new signings, and 3 of those signings that come in, one of them's Menti, one of them's Ferraris, and the striker Gabettos. And that really kicks Torino on to another level. So they do compete for the Scudetto, but they lose narrowly to Roma that season and finish as runners-up. But the shape is already starting to take place. And in the 42-43 season, it's a full season. war is going on in Italy and across Europe and the rest of the world. But football continues in Serie A in Italy as if everything else is okay. And I kind of understand it really because, not that we've lived through war times in the United Kingdom. We've kind of experienced it in our generation with Falklands back in the 80s and the Iraq War in the early 2000s and the one in the 90s. But we've never really experienced anything like what people of the United Kingdom and Italy would have been experiencing in the 1940s. So I can only imagine you want to do the things that's going to boost morale. You want to keep spirits up, and there's nothing better that keeps people's spirits up and takes their mind off other things than football.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's permanently uplifting. That's definitely true. It is extraordinary to think, and I appreciate probably, I don't think you've got the same agents hawking players around the around Europe in quite the same way as it's happened. But it is bizarre to think of those wartime periods. Oh, well, add some signings here, add some signings to the team. You would have thought just even playing would be a bridge too far. He has the vision for this, but he's not actually managing the team, is he? Or is he managing the team as well?
No, he's the president. He's in charge of football. So he has managers. I think Ferrari is one of his managers that has in play. But there's an overarching control that he has. I think Novo was quite a controlling, almost mildly dictatorish in terms of his approach, but not in the sense of the leader that was running Italy at that particular moment. A much softer version that would be open to ideas, even though he had his own mind. And we've seen that by the people that he surrounds himself in. So he's surrounded himself by football people. So I think he's a bit of a visionary, really. I think he's already he's what we'd probably call a Jose Mourinho, what Jose Mourinho was when he came into the game in the early 2000s. One of those kind of visionaries that had an idea, but would take ideas from others to form his own. And the one thing that happened in the 42-43 season, which is the season that Torino do go on and win the championship, the season before in 41-42, Torino had played and lost to Venezia. And in the game, Venezia had two players in the middle of the park, Enzo Loic and Valentino Mazzola, and they just controlled the game. And then it was Novo on that very game that went into the dressing room after the match and practically signed those two players for the following season. Juventus had already kind of earmarked them, the rivals. They were going to take these players in the close season, but their procrastination was Novo's benefit because he didn't mess around. He just signed them up. And that changes everything. They're the two pieces of the jigsaw that really propel this Torino team onto greatness. And most of the parts from 42-43 are in place, and they will go on and service the club right through to the late 1940s.
I did like to think that Noah did a bit of managing himself and was the equivalent of Ron Nodes, but perhaps that would be the wrong the wrong likeness to make. But you're absolutely right. Mazzola is the catalyst for this, and he's the poster child of this side, isn't he?
He was an absolute Rolls Royce of a footballer. Read the game exceptionally well. A fantastic passer, had elegance about him. Would organise on the pitch really well, and just be the consummate leader of the football team on the pitch.
So, as you say, Torino do win their second Scudetto and their first since 1928, I think, in that 1942-43 season. And that sets in motion what can only be described as quite an impressive run of form. I mean, they just then go on and completely dominate. And it's only, I mean, other than the fact they do temporarily stop because of the war, it's just like an endless run, isn't it?
Yeah, well, even during the war, when they had the 1944 War Championship, which was split into two parts, the North and the South, Torino made the final and then had a shock defeat to a bunch of firemen from Spiezza, who just took them by surprise and would win the whole thing. But Torino themselves were probably the best team at that particular moment, going under the guise of a Torino Fiat. But just go back to the 42-43 season and bringing in Loic and Mazzola. They lost to Venezia the season before, and they were pipped to the league by Roma. They then beat Venezia in both games the following season. They win the league by a point, and they take their second Scudetto, as you mentioned. But they also win the Coppa Italia, and they beat Venezia in the final. So they actually become the very first Italian team in the history of the game to do the league and cup double. And you're like this, Graham. They hold on to the Italian Cup for, I think it's 15 years, because when they win it in 1942-43, you're right, football was paused briefly, and the Coppa Italia didn't re-begin again until 1958.
Wow. 15 years of holding fire on that cup competition. That's insane. We should get our timelines in some kind of order. So by the time we get to that 44-45 season, Phil, where is our man Erbstein at this stage?
At the end of the war, 1945, he's in Budapest in Hungary. He stays there for some time. The suggestion is he obviously must have been somewhat traumatized, but I think his family, particularly his two young daughters, were quite traumatized. And the business that he'd set up, although it suffered somewhat, was still relatively successful as well. It wasn't actually until September 1946 that Erbstein returns to Torino. And I love the name. He's kind of a technical director, but his official title is Technical High Supervisor, which I think is a fantastic name, isn't it? So at this point, he's effectively been, Torino had started winning and been consistently winning for some time. But Erbstein himself's been out of the game for 8 years. The only familiar faces he sees when he returns to the club are the backroom staff that he saw when he was there just for a few months before the war. All of the players that he'd managed for a short time in 1938 had either moved on or retired, except for one, which is Gigi Ferrero. He'd become the manager. There'd been a series of kind of interim bosses during the war, but perhaps understandably, Ferraro planned to stay in the position as manager. He's just won the first post-war Italian championship. He was working with a squad of players who you could easily argue are the best in the country around it. He was kind of quite keen to defend his title. So although he wasn't officially the manager, he was the technical high supervisor. He had probably more power. He was probably more powerful than any Italian manager at the time, maybe since, and probably kind of closer to what we think about today around the kind of what's done by a modern day sporting director. But not just a sporting director, he was also doing a lot of the scouting and the sports science that underpinned all of this as well. And it's in 1946-47 when a very successful Torino team go to the next level. So I think in 46-47 they ended up being 10 points ahead of Juventus, scoring 104 goals in 38 games. So they're a pretty decent team to watch. And I think it's in 1947, I like this story around Italy faced Hungary in an international game. Puskas included in the Hungary team and win 3-2 in Turin. And the entire team was drawn from Turin. 10 players from the starting lineup from Torino, and the goalkeeper from Juventus, which is a kind of nice illustration of the way in which Turin was dominating Italian football at the time, but particularly Torino were dominating Italian football at the time.
It's absolutely incredible. I mean, I did do a tiny bit of research beside looking up the 1927 failed season. I wanted to have a look, and I can't believe this is true, but I think this is true. I looked at the Italy squad that goes to the 1938 World Cup, and that squad doesn't have a single Torino player in it. So it really shows within the space of, admittedly quite a bizarre 5 or 6 years or so, but you've basically gone from the national team having no players from your club to it being almost entirely made up of Torino players, which is just unbelievable.
Yeah, they did purchase Pietro Ferreris, who was in that 38 squad. And he's probably worth pointing out because he was a prolific goal scorer, but he has a dramatically different fate to the rest of his team members, because he's one of the few players that actually moves on from this team in the latter stages. But yeah, so they had signed an Italian winner, but you're right, yeah, it's a marked difference, and I think it's down to this guy Novo, who really had a vision and he knew the right pieces to bring in order to create that vision into a reality. I think there's a couple of things in the 45-46 season worth just, I know we've kind of jumped into the third season. It's a North-South league, the first one after the war. They are absolutely smashing teams. They beat Napoli 7-0. And there's a game in which they play Roma. And after 20 minutes of playing Roma, and I think this just demonstrates the class, not just of this football team, but of the people in this football team. They really are the gentlemen of the game, because 20 minutes into the game against Roma, they're winning 6-0. And they then take the metaphorical foot off the brake. And at half time, there's a conversation where they talk about not wanting to embarrass their opponent. They've won the game. They don't need to go flat out. They can save their energy for future matches. And so they kind of agree this pact not to embarrass Roma, the opponent. Within the start of the second half, I think it's Mazzola smashes in a free kick and then just gets a whole load of dirty looks from his teammates as if to say that that's not what we agreed. And it just kind of demonstrates the quality of the team. They were quite happy to beat their opponent, but they didn't want to embarrass their opponent.
Yeah, well, that's sort of the equivalent of scoring from the throne when you're giving it back to the opposition to kick it back to them, isn't it? Phil, you talked about that goal return. I think 103 goals in 30 games or something like that. And as we know, goals in the Italian league are a bit like dog years. They count. 100 goals in the Italian league is about 500 goals in any other league. A free scoring Italian team is not a thing you see very often.
It's not, and it's year after year after year as well. So 1947 to 48 was perhaps even more astonishing. 125 goals, I think, in 40 games, just 33 conceded. So it's not like they just kind of free flowing, just throw everybody forward. They're pretty tight at the back, and all the way through this, their home record is just kind of remarkable. They're just unbeatable at home. And although they did take some pity on Roma, I think in 47, 48, they probably showed slightly less pity. Lucchese, Erbstein's old team, they beat them 6-0. But Alessandria, they beat 10-0. So, maybe it was just too easy at this point. There's not a huge amount of competition. And then it's not just we think defensively about Italian football, maybe slightly unfairly, but you always think it hadn't kind of quite formed in the way that it maybe has today. But the dominance of Juventus with the two Milans, and then this was Torino pushing through. Torino could have been the team that dominated not just in the 1940s but beyond if it hadn't been for the intervention of an aeroplane.
Yeah, the 47-48 season, they actually score 3.13 goals per game, which is incredible. 125 goals in total. I mean, it really is scoring for fun, and they're just ruthless. And I think it's down to the team that Novo has assembled. And it's quite important to point out the core of this team stick together right through all of these championships. So during the war, the championship in 42-43, the nucleus of the team is pretty much the same team that go on and win the championship in 47-48 and then again defend it in 48-49. So there's a consistency with this particular team as well. But what's happened in the background is that Novo is not resting on his laurels. He's aware of this. So he's always looking for younger players, and he's invested in youth to bring in to kind of keep the whole kind of snowball going for Torino. So as players get into their 30s and start getting aged out, although incredibly, Juventus got rid of Gabetti when Torino picked him up in 41-42. By this point, he'd already scored I think almost 200 goals for Juventus. He'd won endless Scudettos. At 25 years old, Juventus have deemed that he's too old. And he goes on to Torino and have an even better career. And he's the only player in the history of the Italian game to have won the championship with both Turin clubs. So he won it with Juve and he won it with Torino. Another player in the history of the game has done that. But it just shows you that Novo had an eye for the players. He knew the type of players he wanted to bring in, which I think Phil's already alluded to.
Throughout this, I have struggled with people's job titles and exactly who is managing and coaching exactly which team and which bit of it. Because they bring in Leslie Leavesley, who gets quite a lot of attention as he comes from Manchester, I think, doesn't he? As a Brit who ends up coaching them. Now, I'd read, I'm not clear whether he's the manager or whether he's actually the manager of the youth team, but I think that kind of plays into what you were talking about there, Jamie, that actually the investment is in the next group of players coming through. There seems to be a production line approach to it.
Yeah, there really is. So, I mean, they are changing the team as it goes along, and quite significantly, there's a player who comes in the I think in 1948, Saro Toma. He's a very significant individual, and he's come through the youth system, and he's been biding his time and struggling to get into the team because he kind of plays in the same position as this rock at the back, Rigamonte, who's an absolutely larger-than-life, colourful character. Mario Rigamonte would regularly turn up to games, organise Serie A games with minutes to go before kickoff. And it would just be accepted because of the type of person he was and the player he was, it was allowed. So there's clearly different rules for different players. And Rigamonte was the type of player that would quite happily go motorbiking for weeks on weeks on weeks on end and living the large life. And in the 48-49 season, Toma really believes he's got his chance because Rigamonte hasn't turned up for pre-season training. No one's seen him. And it's just accepted that this is his behaviour. So the youngster coming through the youth system under Leslie Leavesley's under tender, Toma thinks, right, this is my chance. I'm going to get into the team. And literally on the opening game of the season, 15, 20 minutes before kickoff, Mario Rigamonte turns up and Toma is relegated back to the bench and doesn't start because the team have decided that they want to go with the experience, and Mario Rigamonte is that experience at that particular moment. But Toma's time will come.
So we get to the 49 season, 48-49 season. At this point, Torino have won 4 in a row. 48-49 is going to be... It looks pretty much as though the tournament is coming home once again, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think Torino are on the verge of winning Serie A. They didn't have the greatest of starts, but then towards the end went on an 18-game unbeaten run. And with 4 games to go, they had a 4-point lead. So they were looking pretty set when they were invited to play Benfica in a friendly match in May 1949. This wasn't the first time, though, that they'd kind of travelled on aeroplanes and had a few problems as well. I think, Jamie, you were saying before the call they had a pre-season tour the year before in Brazil and had a few plane problems.
Yeah, so in the 47-48 season, the profile of this football team is growing around the world. They're a draw. They're a financial draw. And the popularity of air travel is growing as well. So teams are able to reach these places. And it's not unusual for the teams to turn into like a Harlem Globetrotters. So Torino go to a tour to Brazil where they play 4 games. And it's a long journey. I mean, they're routing via Barcelona down to Dakar, across to Recife, down to Rio de Janeiro, then down to Sao Paulo just to kind of play these games. And the last part of that leg, they fly on a bit of a rickety aircraft, I think it's a Dakota, and Rio de Janeiro down to Sao Paulo. And I think it kind of puts a bit of fear into the players who are used to flying. They do, even in Italy, they would fly to the occasional game. In Puglia, if they're playing Bari, they would fly down to Bari. So it kind of puts a bit of fear into the players. But the popularity and notoriety of this particular team is growing to the extent that they are invited to play in this Testimonios. So Benfica player Francisco Ferreira, who's coming to the end of his career, and Portugal wasn't a big league at this particular moment. The players didn't get anywhere near the salaries that the Italian players were getting. So Ferreira knew that if he could convince Torino to come and play in his testimonial in Lisbon, then that would potentially increase his chances of getting a payday and his kind of payoff for his football career. Now, originally, Bologna were penciled to go and play in Ferrara's testimonial, but something significant happens in February of 49. So Italy go to Portugal and play in an international game, of which at the time Ferrara starts talking to Mazzola. So Valentino Mazzola, the captain and influential character inside Torino, and Ferrara says to him, look, it'd be great if you guys could come and play in my testimonial. It would really be the greatest honour. And it kind of goes quiet for a month. And then a month later, Italy are playing in Spain, in Madrid. And Ferrara's there, come across from the border in Portugal. And he then reminds Mazzola of this. So Mazzola, being the gentleman, takes it on board and puts in motion the chain of events that will effectively replace Bologna going to Lisbon for Torino to go and play in this testimonial when there's only 4 games of the season to go. It seems a strange time to go and play a testimonial. And they did have to rearrange the fixtures in Italy. So they were due to play Inter on the 1st of May, and they had to bring that fixture back to the 30th of May. Now, Inter were happy to do that at the time because they were going for the championship with Torino, so they saw it as a potential advantage. But yeah, the kind of chain of events is put in motion once Ferrara has made this request to Mazzola to get Torino to come and play in Lisbon for his testimonial.
As tends to happen with these kinds of incidents and tragedies and stories, is there is this sort of, you know, these moments where small decisions, which, you know, have you know, a relatively, you know, limited meaning, where they have these outsized impacts on players, you know, in terms of those that make the squad, those that end up on the plane or not on the plane. It's the same with the Munich air disaster as well. You know, with all these stories, there's a kind of, well, what if they'd left the previous day or not tried to take off or whatever it is. But as you say, it does seem very strange to be playing this testimonial at such a crucial point in the season.
What are we talking about? May the 4th, 1949, around 5 o'clock, kind of spring afternoon. You don't expect this type of weather, but there was a very cloudy sky. The rain was kind of pouring down. There was very low cloud over the river coming in coming into Turin, and the Torino players are in a Fiat G212 flying in from
Very
Lisbon into Italy and into Turin. I worry slightly saying all of this and talking to an aviation journalist, but here you go. These are kind of the amateurs going to come out here across the. No, it's difficult to kind of quite understand what actually kind of happened on the day. The pilot of the plane, and there was a number of inquiries that kind of followed to try and understand what happened, and broadly they kind of came to similar conclusions. The pilot of the plane transporting the Torino team, the staff, as well as some journalists, 31 passengers in total, was Pier Luigi Moroni, and he was an expert pilot. He'd won medals during the war. He knew the area very well. The plane was relatively new. It didn't have a radar, but it was a relatively new, well-maintained plane. There's no indication that the plane somehow was at fault. Instead, it was probably a mistake that was kind of caused by human error in the terrible weather that day. So the idea was that pilots would use the Basilica, the Catholic Church on the hill, as a reference point for their descent into the airport in Turin. They usually kind of gave it, obviously, kind of quite a significant leeway. But Moroni, in the weather conditions, probably only saw the Basilica at the last minute, and the plane with everybody in it went crashing into the wall. As you can imagine, it was pretty horrific. Nobody survived. The bodies that they could find were burned. One of the first suitcases that were opened that gave away that this was a plane that was carrying the Torino team was a suitcase that carried all of the shirts of the team. And that's when I think people kind of started to realise that actually this was the team and everybody on it was gone.
there's really nothing that the pilot can do by the time they find themselves in that situation. I think there's a suggestion that possibly one of the altitude meter or something like that wasn't quite right as well, which might have added confusion. It goes down as it's an extraordinary, devastating loss and a major loss. I mean, there have been other big kind of sports teams that have been lost, not just in football, across a range of sports through aviation, especially back in that era where air safety wasn't at the level it is. But it is, I think, the effect this has on Torino and on Italian football is just massive, isn't it, Jamie?
Yeah, it really is. It devastates the whole country. I think there were up to or maybe greater than 500,000 people that lined the streets and squares of Turin for the funeral service that took place just a few days later on the 6th of May. All 31 passengers that perished on the flight were given a ceremonious send-off. But it did really devastate Italian football. And as you say, Graham, there had been disasters for sports teams prior to this, but I don't think in associated football, I think this is the first time that football had experienced such a crisis. And yeah, Phil, you're right. It's bizarre. I mean, I've read a couple of books on this and they go into a bit of detail. And I read that at 5:02, the captain, Rooney, reports in with Tower that everything's good, and I think he's kind of joked around with one of his friends as well to get him a coffee. And 5:05, just 3 minutes later, there's no contact with the tower whatsoever. It's deadly silence, and they can't reach the plane. So it does feel, and I've also read that there's been a number of, and it's like classic one of these things, isn't it? You kind of get the conspiracy theories that come out afterwards because you don't have all the information. And this predates also being a bit nervous because of the airline journalists on this, of course. I think this predates black box or flight information. There was, the flight event wasn't recorded, so there was no way of really knowing with any deal of certainty what caused the incident. But I think, as Phil said, I think it was just one of those things where the weather conditions caught the captain out on this particular occasion, and the team perished. Now, there are a couple of significant things that happened just before this. Not just before this, but before this happened. So we've already talked about the golden boy, the captain, Valentino Mazzola. Now, Valentino Mazzola was lining up a move to Inter Milan, and he expected that move to happen the season of 48-49. And there were contract negotiations that ran on into late September that were finally resolved, and Mazzola stayed. But he'd written a letter to a close friend to say that he was off to Inter Milan for 48-49, and then he was frustrated with the way that Torino were dealing with it. So Mazzola should have gone, but didn't go. That's a what if. Then you've got Toma, who's come in. We've mentioned the youth team product from Leslie Levy's youth team. Leslie Levy himself unfortunately perished on the plane. And a career in football was cut short there for somebody who I think would have gone on to greater things. So Toma's come in, finally got his chance. He's played in the first few games of the season, and he's picked up a knee injury that will rule him out for the rest of the season. So he's not fit to travel. He's not on the aircraft that goes to Lisbon, that comes back to Turin via Barcelona. And then you've got the man himself, Ferruccio Novo, who would have normally been on that trip, but he's been knocked out with flu. So he's unfit to travel. So you've got these incredible turn of events, as you say, Graham, these small little events that seem to mean nothing in the moment, but when you weigh them up against the grand scheme of things, they're incredibly significant, life-changing for Mazzola, life-saving for Novo and Toma.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Mazzola, it's also worth saying, he got married for a second time, I think, on the 20th of April or something, 2 weeks beforehand. All these kind of things that just kind of make the thing real. And Novo doesn't really recover from this, does he?
No, Torino go into a bit of a dark place. He tries to rebuild. He tries to apply all the things that he's done before, but it's beyond imagination what a tragedy like that could do to you psychologically and mentally. And for all of his efforts, he can't bring Torino back to the greatness that he had achieved through the 1940s with a very special bunch of football players.
It's worth saying, of course, that they do win they're awarded the title for 48-49. Don't every it's all at the request almost of all the other Italian clubs, and I think those last games are played, but are they played with youth players or something like that?
Yeah, but that's right. So Torino was awarded the championship, but they decided to play the last 4 games, and like you said, Graham, they were using youth team players, and the opponents also used youth players as well. We can see parallels actually with what happened with the Munich air crash, where other clubs in that case stepped in and loaned Manchester United players and did help them, at least for a time. But the next home game must have been a pretty emotional game. The game started in complete silence, although after a while there was a cry in the stadium, and the supporters started singing, and Torino went on to beat Genoa 4-0 in that game. So they maintained their unbeaten home record, which would only actually kind of fall the following season as well. But as Jamie says, in 49-50, Torino finished 6th in Serie A. In 51, they were 15th, and by 1959, they were relegated out to Serie A as well. So it was a kind of a continuous process of decline after the Superga crisis, which probably also kind of fed in not just in terms of Torino as well, but there's some suggestion as well that also had a massive impact in terms of the Italian game and the national team in particular. Some suggestion that Superga, the crash, put the game back in Italy by around kind of 30 years. So the national squad really didn't perform decently at a World Cup till 1970. They went out in the first round in 1950, 1954 and 1962 and 1966, and didn't even kind of qualify in 1958. And the national team, now actually heavily influenced and controlled by Novo, decided for the 1950 World Cup to book a boat rather than fly to Brazil, for understandable reasons. So the boat trip to Brazil took 2 weeks. Most of the players were seasick if they weren't bored most of the time, and perhaps understandably they performed badly and went out in the first round.
The manager of Italy at that time, and who'd been manager throughout the 30s, I think, as well. Yeah, and he's left with this is the grisly task of helping to identify victims, as he knows them so well from having coached them at international level as well. And again, that seems to be kind of the end of his career as well to some extent.
Yeah, he was close to that anyway. He'd won the World Cup with Italy in 34-38, so he was coming to the kind of the latter moments of his career. But you're right, yeah, he was one of the first on the scene after the plane had hit the Superga. So, it's beyond imagination what horrors he was seeing, but it wasn't easy to identify some of his players that he'd had for national duty, and they did have to rely on things like passports in order to identify the players. Such was the graphic nature of the crash.
So yes, Torino, they never really recover. They do win another Scudetto, don't they, Jamie?
Yeah, 75-76, they have a moment to rejoice. So they are back in after their relegation in 59. As Phil mentioned, they do return back to Serie A. And they win a couple of cups as well along the way. So I think they pick up a couple of Coppa Italias in the 60s and early 70s. And then in 1975-76, they do pit their rivals Juventus to the championship and win by 2 points.
Talking about their rivals, Juventus, actually a little bit, because Turin is an absolute centre of football within Italy. And this Torino side definitely, at this point, were the dominant force. But it is Juventus that have gone on and dominated, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Juve were always dominating, even before Torino's 5 successive titles. Juventus have already done this as well, between 30 and 35. But Juve go on and just dominate. I think they've got 36 total championships in Italian football, which is miles ahead of the next team, which is Inter Milan with 20. Yeah, Juve are just an absolute force. And it's really interesting, no matter where you go in Italy, and I've spent time in the south, I've spent time in Sicily, and you can't help but talk football. When you ask people who they support, no matter where they're from, they support Juventus. So you could be talking to somebody in Lecce, you could be talking to somebody in Palermo, which have big football teams, but they're Juve fans.
I mean, that wouldn't happen in England.
Juventus,
you wouldn't get any award-winning actors.
Juventus don't play in England.
You wouldn't get any award-winning Italian actors supporting Juventus.
Gary, you talked about one thing I forgot to mention. I think it was worth covering briefly. This had a devastating impact on Italian football, but it was really the ripples of the crash and the disaster were felt right round the world. Because as we mentioned, Torino had gone to Brazil, so their fame had reached into South America. And another brilliant team at that time, a team that we've covered on this podcast, River Plate, their president, who reached out to Novo and arranged a benefit match for River Plate to come over shortly after the disaster to play Torino in a benefit match to raise funds for the families of the bereaved, which is a fantastic gesture. But it kind of it gives us that scenario that you dream of. River Plate, who are dominating championships in Argentina and probably the best team in South America with the great Alfredo Di Stefano and Padonera. And then you've got this Torino team. But the way that they are brought together is just in tragic circumstances. And it's not the kind of the heavyweight matchup you'd have wished for.
And Phil, I suppose, just to round off Ernstein's story as well, I suppose, because he's obviously on board this aircraft as well.
He is, yeah. So he leaves behind his wife and his 2 children. So it seems a little bit unfair that he managed to survive the First World War, the Second World War in forced labour in a labour camp, escaping and hiding in the attic of his sister-in-law before returning to football, and then he only had a few short years. But quite a remarkable individual person, as well as kind of coach as well. It's got if there is going to be a kind of quite a nice story. His 2 daughters, who obviously had kind of gone through traumatic time during the war, grew up and were incredibly successful. One of them is a very successful psychologist, and the other one became a prima ballerina as well. So there's some joy that kind of comes out of the tragedy, certainly for the 2 daughters, for their resilience and their ability to kind of contribute despite everything that was against them.
Yeah, and on that vein as well, it's probably worth pointing out that Sandro Mazzola, Valentino's son, who was 6 years old at the time when his father perished in the crash, goes on to play for Inter Milan and be one of Italy's most successful footballers. So you've got the family name of Mazzola living on with an incredible legacy in Sandro Mazzola.
Yes. So an incredible story. We've touched on some of the key players in this: Novo, Erbstein, Mazzola. There are plenty more within this. We should probably get round to ranking where this team features. We have 5 categories of greatness. We don't need to go too far down the list on this one. So at the top, we have all-time greats, true greats behind that, followed by touch greatness, edge greatness, blinker greats. Jamie, I'm pretty sure I know where you're going with this one, but where are you going with this one?
Well, I'm going to flavour it a little bit. So obviously we've got 2 incredible protagonists in Novo and Ernstein, who are ahead of their time, and they have a vision that we're quite familiar with nowadays, but not so familiar back in the 1940s. They're only one of 4 teams to have won 5 successive championships. We've mentioned Juventus, who have done it twice, also Inter Milan. They accumulated the most points in a season when it was 2 points for a win, 65. In fact, they were getting over 60 points regularly when they were winning their 5 championships, which is quite incredible. They scored 125 goals in a single season. That still hasn't been beaten in Italian football. And I don't think it will ever be beaten in Italian football. I think that record is pretty safe and secure. And they also, up until 06-07, when Inter Milan finally beat it, they had the most wins in a Serie A season with 28. And Inter Milan in 06-07 went on and won 30 games and beat that record. It's just been beaten a few times since. Incredible players. We've just touched the surface. I've got my little team sheet here, which I did, which I could have brought you through. But, most of these guys in this team are all playing way over 100 games. Baci Galuppo, the goalkeeper, we haven't even talked about him, was a charismatic character, along with Martinelli and I think it's Ballerin. They were like the nice guys. They were called the Trionizza, which basically translates as nice guys. 3 nice guys. Yeah, they're all playing over 100, 150. Gabetto scores 125 goals in 225 games after having a brilliant career with Juventus. He goes on to have a better career with Torino. It's just a fantastic collection of players, and I'm rambling on to the point of where you knew I was going to be from the very beginning, and that is Torino, 1940s all-time greats.
Phil, where do you put this team?
Yeah, I think I agree. It's remarkable. In 5 winning seasons, Torino scored 483 goals, conceded just 165. I think Jamie mentioned only really Juventus in the 30s and Milan in the 90s have come close to that record, in some cases exceeding it in places. It's still pretty remarkable. The characters involved, from the players like Mazzola through to Novo, but particularly for me, Erbstein and his backstory. I wonder what he could have achieved if he'd stayed at Torino and if he'd been allowed to kind of coach the team for a good number of years. Maybe today we'd be talking about the 2 Milan teams, Juventus and Torino, as the kind of dominant forces in Italian football. Because with that amount of technical and organisational prowess, there would have been no stopping them.
It is very difficult to see how that team, how its dominance would have stopped in any other way, actually, other than through tragedy, actually. Sort of commitment to renewing the side and the visionary approach to Novo in particular, I think, kind of illustrates that they were head and shoulders above anyone else playing at the time, and you just think that would have carried on. The tragedy obviously defines this story. That's what kind of takes it to a sort of a different level. I don't think you should underplay the achievements of this side, and I don't think you'll find any dissenters from either me or Phil. So Torino, the 1940s giants of Italian football, all-time greats. Good, Tim. I have to say, not a story I was particularly familiar with beforehand. I think it's really interesting how, outside of, if you just spend your whole time skulking around in the lower leagues of English football, that the enormity of this story is kind of lost. It seems extraordinary when you look at it. You think, well, hang on, how do I not know more about this? And I think I knew it happened. I knew they'd been playing, but I hadn't really recognised anything of the level of their achievement before actually. And I did do some research. I just didn't say very much.
It's quite strange, isn't it? In the book that you mentioned, Jamie, which I had a kind of look at, is it Calico? I can't remember the name of the book now. About Italian football.
There's a few on there, and that's the thing. There's a movie been made about this, an Italian movie.
Yeah,
there are a number
of
books, blog, podcast. I got The Day Italian Football Died. I mean, I got this about. God, it must have been 15, almost 20 years ago, I would think. I think it was written in 2000, 2001. So I've had it for ages, and I think I read it on a holiday to Mexico. And that was really my introduction to this particular team, because until then I'd never really learned about them, and it was just fascinating, and it's just a linear digest in terms of this particular team. But yeah, I mean, there is a movie out there as well. If you can go find it, I think it's just called Il Grande Torino, which isn't the Clint Eastwood version. Just in case you put it on and get a little bit confused, and you forget that Clint Eastwood was actually a big, powerful centre back.
It was Calcio, that history of Italian football I was thinking of, where they're not mentioned as much as you might imagine, really. I kind of was expecting a little bit more about them and about Erbstein, which is why I think I went off on a tangent and then got fascinated by his backstory.
So I must commend you both on your aviation commentary during that. I did. Despite my storied 30-year career writing about aviation, I don't do very many safety stories, it has to be said. So I did consult my colleague David Kaminsky-Morrow of Flight Global, who's our absolute legend of the aviation safety game, to see if there was anything he could, any light he could shed on this. Actually, there wasn't really very much. He did know there weren't. There hadn't been an enormous number of G212s made or built. There weren't, in fact, very many.
Not after that.
Slightly unusual. Yeah. No, definitely not. Slightly unusual 3-engine design as well. But yes, I hope there might be some brilliant additional fact I could bring to the party, but sadly not. But I did do my research. That is the end of this week's episode, and we are approaching our mid-winter break, so we're going to be having a few weeks off. When we come back, we have some blinding stories lined up. We will be looking at West Ham 1975. We'll be looking at almost certainly the Arsenal Invincibles. We're hoping to do Jack Charleston's Republic of Ireland. And maybe it is time to do the amazing 1986 Milk Cup winning side, whoever that might be. And we also might try a little Christmas special, Jamie.
Yes. So we are thinking, probably breaking news for Phil, of bringing in a few of our regulars to increase the participation of our guests, and doing a special 5 or 6 team episode where we're limited to just 10 minutes to talk about the team that we are promoting into a bracket of greatness. And then the rest of us have to decide whether that team deserves to be in that bracket of greatness or not, or needs to go up or down. So I think we're going to shape what we're calling the Christmas special that should be out on the 26th of December.
Excellent. Okay, we'll leave it there. Phil, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Very much enjoyed it.
Jamie, thank you again.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Absolutely first class, Phil. Brilliant stuff as always. Really, really did enjoy your storytelling of Erbstein.
It's Herb. At various points, I called him Ernstein as well. I've called him just about everything. Ernstein. But Erbstein, I think we maybe
Erbstein. Ernő Erbstein.
We didn't actually reference. Yeah, we didn't reference his middle name, which is Ergy as well. So he's a triple E.
Yeah.
Isn't that a battery?
Yes, definitely so. Triple E. Excellent. Okay, we will leave it there. We'll be off for 2 or 3 weeks, but you can catch us on our Boxing Day special, and then we'll be back with the second half of our season in January.